It isn't like the last recession or the last big opportunity that the world is ever going to get is past. There'll be opportunities in the future. There are times that are easier and there are times which are harder. A, the valuations have come up, and B, the competition sorting through those opportunities is more intelligent and more aggressive and more numerous. Of course, it's harder. The net result is people are going to get worse results. I think valuations will go up and down because they always have. And I think we'll have smart people in this game forever. Lots of them. The opportunities that we all remember came from a demoralized period when about 90% of the natural stock buyers got very discouraged with stocks. That's what created the opportunity for these fabulous records that my generation had. And that was a rare opportunity that came to a rare group of people, of whom I was one, and Warren was another. And people who start now have a much less, they have lower opportunity. There were huge opportunities then. With all this massive central bank interference, I think that was necessary to do. As I admire the politicians who did it and the technocrats, including the Federal Reserve people. And I think it was absolutely required, and that the danger they were avoiding was worse than the troubles they caused. But it was very peculiar, and it did have the accidental effect of bailing out the rich in order to help the poor. And nobody was doing that because they loved the rich. They just didn't have any other tool in the kit, and they had to do something. It wasn't malevolence, and it was an accident, and it probably won't happen again. And it's not a permanent conspiracy against the poor. It was an accident that we had the huge recession, caused partly by massive stupidity in finance and venality. And then when we ran out of tools and had to do something really peculiar that we'd never done before, that was a wise thing to do given the amount of trouble we were in. You got to remember that if the trouble had been allowed to run, we might have had a revisitation of the kind of troubles that brought Hitler into power. So we were facing real difficulties. And both parties and our technocrats got together for the last time, I think, and worked us out of it. So it was a very admirable thing in which you can all be proud. I've been proud of nothing in politics since. But that was a high moment. I don't think they have to destroy some inequality. It's probably going to go away by itself. I think we hit a peak of inequality because the authorities had no alternative but to print a lot of money. Of course, that bailed out asset values. But that was a fluke, and they can't really do more of it. They've played that game once as much as they really can. And so I don't think people who are worried about inequality should worry too much about a lot more of it from a lot more interest rate lowering. That's as natural as breathing. So far, it's played out in waves. Sometimes the Democrats are in and sometimes the Republicans. In my lifetime, the country has run better net because we had two parties, each of which was partly in control. If either party had been totally in control of all branches of the government, I think we would be way worse off today. By going back and forth with a lot of political tension, I think we got about the right amount of social safety net. It would have been evil not to have as much, and we probably couldn't afford a lot more. We got one in the time of Abraham Lincoln. It took a civil war to create it, but I think it's unlikely that we have. The last time we got a third-party movement, it just elected one of the two parties who otherwise would not have been elected. I would prefer that two parties hated each other less and that everyone was more rational. You don't like vast political excess and shouted epithets and so forth. But what can I do about it? I can be cheerful. We're in new territory, but it doesn't mean that it's crystal clear we can't get by what we've done. We just know we're in uncharted territory. I don't worry much because I regard it as a cinch that a great nation will in due time be ruined. So it's just a question of time, and where is Rome, where is Britain in its heyday? They all pass, and so our turn is bound to come someday, but I don't like thinking about it too much. It's like my own death. Why should I enjoy thinking about it? But is it coming someday? Sure, of course it is.
But you have no guess as to when?
No.
Sooner or later.
Well, I think it's natural to have some tension over. The truth of the matter is that Ricardo, when he invented the law of comparative advantage, did not predict that someday the law of comparative advantage would greatly accelerate the growth of some poor nation which had a particularly able populace, like China. That free trade would enable them to come up rapidly and take a lot of power away from the companies that had been on top and liked being on top. He just didn't think about it. Once we realized it could happen, I don't think it's crazy to think there may be some limit to the amount of destruction we want to occur in our aerospace industry or something. Right. So I don't regard free trade as such a pure thing that we could never, under any circumstances, intervene. And I think that the advantages to the United States and China to getting along are so great on both sides that I anticipate that they will reach some tolerable adjustment. I don't consider it wrong to have some limits on free trade that matter to the United States. I don't want many. I don't want them to be huge, but some limits on the operation of free trade are quite acceptable. I basically believe in a lot of trade because I want two countries with a lot of hydrogen bombs to be trading happily with one another instead of posturing the way we are with Russia. Mm-hmm. So I vastly prefer our relations with China to our relations with Russia. And I think China thinks likewise. And I anticipate that we will get along. It will be crazy on both sides if the United States and China don't. If there's any one country both sides should want to keep friendly, it's the other. It's a nuclear war. A nuclear war would be a real disaster. Global warming is something we could cope with if we had to. But a nuclear war, that is really serious. I'm all for making the Russian relationship better, too. That's difficult, but you got to work at it. I don't think the right way to handle every tough guy that's fighting against you is with unlimited hostility. There are times, I think, when they ought to be killed with kindness, even if they're wrong. There are worse things in the world when you're rich and powerful than giving a little for the peace of the world. I don't think since the day they invented the hydrogen bomb, I've had a moment when I didn't think that mankind's main problem was avoiding a modern war using hydrogen bombs. It's a very serious problem. I think the behavior of the mortgage and banking industry and the delusional prosperity that preceded the great real estate bust was obscene, practically everywhere. And I think that the people who got into a lot of the trouble richly deserved it. And I think they didn't get enough. They were bailed out to some extent because the country had to do it. But it never should have been allowed to run. All that disgusting lying and cheating and delusional assumptions. And it was just, we all would consider it totally illicit and awful to adulterate the baby food to make more money, to an extent where the babies died. And they were doing pretty much the same thing with their basic product. They were adulterating it so badly that it threatened the whole welfare of the republic. This was deeply evil. Is there still some craziness in finance? Of course, there always will be. But it's way better. Nobody knows how much of this money printing we can do. And of course, we have politicians who and are both parties, who like to believe that it doesn't matter how much you do. We can ignore the whole subject and just print money as convenient. Well, that's the way the Roman Empire behaved, and it was ruined. That's the way the Weimar Republic was ruined. There is a point where it's dangerous. My attitude when something is big and dangerous is to stay a long way away from it. Other people want to come as close as possible without going in. That's too tricky for me. I don't like it. If there's a big whirlpool in the river, I stay a long way away from it. There were a bunch of canoeists once that tried to run the Erin Rapids. I think they were from Scandinavia. And the fact that the whirlpools were so big made them very eager to tackle this huge challenge. The death rate was 100%. I regard that as a normal result. I was surprised when central banks started printing money and buying massive amounts of private securities. And they hadn't done that previously in my lifetime, at least not in a big way. And they did it massively. And it seems to have worked considerably. And that surprised me. And by the way, it surprised the whole economics profession. If you read the textbooks on economics, nobody was predicting that this would be the logical response. You're never out of it until you're dead. Well, all human successes are successes so far. And this is a success so far, and we don't know for sure what the ultimate consequences would be. In the old days, when people thought the currency should be backed with gold, and they wanted the inflation rate to be zero and the social safety net to be almost zero, they created a lot of GDP growth and a lot of prosperity, but with horrible recessions. And to some extent, the recessions automatically cured themselves. When we got into the business of big interventions, driven by the example of the Great Depression, what we got is pretty much a century of extreme prosperity with relatively minor recessions. But we're using methods that are so extreme that maybe we can't use a lot more of them. And we don't know the answer to that. If an economist told me he knew the answer to that, I wouldn't believe him. Either way, it wouldn't matter which way his opinion was. I just think we don't know. The reason the economists are wrong is because it's so hard. You know, the Greek philosopher who said, a man never steps into the same river twice. You know, the man is different, and so is the river when he goes in the second time. That's the trouble with economics. It's not like physics. It's the same recipe, done a different time gets a different result. And I don't think the economics profession, I think they're gradually coming to that recognition, but it makes their subject harder, not more easy. And they weren't handling it so perfectly even when they thought it was easier. So of course it's hard for them. Why would anybody think they know exactly? Take Japan's present position. Yeah. Japan double its national debt just because it feels like it. From here, I don't know.
People trying to figure out what the secret to life is, to a long and happy life.
That is easy because it's so simple. Don't have a lot of envy, you don't have a lot of resentment, you don't overspend your income, you stay cheerful in spite of your troubles, you deal with reliable people, and you do what you're supposed to do. And all these simple rules work so well to make your life better, and they're so trite.
How old were you when you figured this out?
About 7. I could tell that some of my older people were a little bonkers. I've always been able to recognize when other people were a little bonkers. And it helped me because there's so much irrationality in the world, and I've been thinking about it for a long time. Its causes and its preventions and so forth. Sure, it's helped me. And staying cheerful, because it's the wise thing to do. Is that so hard? And can you be cheerful when you're absolutely mired in deep hatred and resentment? Of course you can't. So why would you take it on?
Is there any advice you would go back and give your 20-year-old self?
Many of my children have worked out well, and I've had very little to do with it. I think they come into the world to a certain extent pre-made, and you just sit there and watch. It's been simply amazing to me as a parent to note how much is sort of preordained. The shy baby is a shy adult. The booming, obnoxious, domineering baby is the booming, domineering, obnoxious adult. I have never found a way to fix that. I can be cheerful about it, but I can't fix it. I can change my reaction, but I can't change the outcome.